Richard Lancaster halted in the marble hallway of the sprawling Pacific Heights mansion, feeling as though the floor had vanished beneath his expensive Italian shoes. He had entered through the side door to avoid the staff, his suitcase still in hand, his dark shirt wrinkled from the cross-country flight between New York and San Francisco, and his face drawn from 3 sleepless nights. He had intended to surprise Anna, perhaps find her resting in their room, and apologize for his excessively long absence, but his mother's voice sliced through the slightly open door of the main drawing room like a sharpened blade. "If this child is born in this house, I personally guarantee he will never carry the Lancaster name," Eleanor said with a venomous calm that Richard recognized from ruthless corporate boardrooms, but never from their domestic life. From inside, Anna replied softly, yet with an unbreakable firmness, telling Eleanor that she could remove her name from the door, but she could never tear her child away. His mother let out a dry, dismissive laugh, questioning if the child was merely the best-planned strike their family had ever suffered, prompting Anna's voice to tremble momentarily as she insisted she had never asked Richard for a single dime. Eleanor slammed something hard onto the glass coffee table, accusing Anna of waiting for a much larger payout, causing Richard to grip his suitcase handle until his knuckles turned entirely white. The drawing room, usually a magnificent space boasting sweeping views of the Golden Gate Bridge bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon, suddenly felt smaller than a prison cell. Anna stood defensively beside the pale linen sofa, one hand protectively cradling her 6-month pregnant belly, the other clutching the simple fabric of her pale blue dress, while Eleanor maintained her flawlessly rigid posture, her beautiful face hardened by decades of absolute control. On the center table lay an opened envelope, a heavily marked legal document, and a solid silver pen placed deliberately like a loaded weapon. Eleanor ordered her to sign it immediately, promising a sum large enough for Anna to disappear with dignity and spare the family a public scandal. Anna stared at the paper, then at the woman who had spent months smiling warmly in front of Richard, asking softly how many times Eleanor had rehearsed this cruel speech in front of her antique mirror. Eleanor lifted her chin arrogantly, stating she had survived far better women trying to infiltrate their prestigious lineage, to which Anna took a deep breath and asked why, then, was Eleanor so terrified of her. The question drastically shifted the temperature of the room, drawing Eleanor's gaze down to Anna's neck, where a small, antique, shell-shaped pendant rested against her skin. A detail Richard had always considered an intimate quirk, but which now made his mother turn completely pale for a fleeting, terrifying second. Recovering too quickly, Eleanor demanded to know where the necklace came from, her voice losing its polished elegance for the very first time. Anna clutched the pendant, revealing it belonged to her mother, a woman who cleaned hotel rooms on double shifts, came home smelling of harsh disinfectants, and still taught her daughter never to bow her head to people who confused a wealthy surname with actual moral character. Eleanor's expression grew dangerously hard, warning the pregnant woman that there were doors she should never dare to open. But Anna stood tall, declaring that there were sins a family simply could not bury forever in the dark. Richard pushed the heavy oak door open with enough force to make it hit the wall, stepping into the room and causing both women to spin around in profound shock. Anna's face instantly lost all its color, not out of relief, but out of a deep, agonizing shame that hurt Richard far more than any accusation ever could. Eleanor, conversely, swiftly regained her imposing composure, greeting him as if he had merely arrived early for a casual Sunday brunch. Richard stared at the silver pen, the hostile contract, Anna's trembling hands, and finally his mother, stating coldly that he had arrived early enough to hear his own mother threatening to erase his unborn son from their family legacy. When Richard desperately asked how long this had been going on, Anna replied without looking at him, stating it had been long enough for her to stop, hoping he would ever notice her quiet suffering. As Martha, the loyal housekeeper who had served the family for 20 years, hesitantly interrupted to announce an urgent call from a lawyer named Arthur Vance, Anna grabbed her modest purse. She looked at Eleanor and Richard one last time, declaring that sometimes a woman walks away, because she finally understands that staying is just another way of completely losing herself. Richard stood frozen in the grand drawing room as Anna walked out the front door, resisting the brutal urge to chase her down the affluent San Francisco street because a rotting truth lay on the table between him and his mother. He snatched a partially hidden folder from beneath a glossy magazine, ignoring Eleanor's frantic attempt to grab it back from his hands. Inside, he found an old, faded copy of a birth certificate, a torn photograph, and handwritten notes bearing the name Sutton and Company. In the torn piece of the photograph, Richard clearly recognized a much younger version of his late father, standing beside a dark-haired woman wearing the exact same shell pendant that Anna wore every single day. Meanwhile, Anna rode a taxi across the city, keeping both hands firmly over her belly as if she could shield her unborn son from the immense pain radiating from the Lancaster mansion. The bustling city blurred past the window, the bright lights and towering buildings, feeling completely disconnected from the emotional devastation she had just endured. When the car finally turned onto a narrow, familiar street in the Mission District, far away from the aggressive wealth of Pacific Heights, Anna felt her tense shoulders finally begin to drop. She was not running away like a coward. She was returning to the only place where her personal history did not require an engraved invitation to exist. The old apartment building where her mother had spent her final years possessed worn walls, a temperamental elevator, and the comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting down the hallway. Inside the modest, perfectly clean apartment, everything remained exactly as Mary Sutton had left it, including a framed photograph of her mother smiling warmly on a windy beach, wearing the fateful necklace. Anna placed her purse on a wooden chair and finally allowed her tears to fall, crying not because of Eleanor's predictable cruelty, but because Richard's love had arrived with a look of utter astonishment rather than unwavering certainty. Her quiet morning was interrupted by a phone call from Arthur Vance, her mother's old, trusted attorney, whose gravelly voice sounded unusually urgent and thick with worry. He warned Anna that her mother had made him promise to wait, but Eleanor Lancaster knew too much, and the aggressive settlement offer proved the pregnancy had drastically altered the hidden battlefield. Arthur insisted they needed to meet the very next morning, pleading with Anna not to sign anything bearing the Lancaster name, not even out of a misguided sense of love for her oblivious husband. Back in the mansion, Richard locked himself inside his private study, a rare act of defiance in a house where closed doors were historically forbidden against the matriarch. He spread the contents of the Sutton file across his massive oak desk, staring intensely at the torn photograph of his father and the woman named Mary Sutton. When Eleanor barged in, demanding he stop digging into the past of an opportunistic woman, Richard stood up, his eyes burning with a newly discovered, chilling coldness. He flatly accused his mother of spending months calling his wife a gold digger while secretly hoarding a hidden archive of her mother's erased history. Deep in the middle of the night, unable to find sleep on the small sofa, Anna finally broke the seal on a hidden letter her mother had left behind for her. Mary Sutton's delicate handwriting explained that she had loved an impossible man, but her greatest mistake was trusting people who preached about honor while ruthlessly trading human lives in closed boardrooms. The letter revealed that the Sutton family had lost their beloved coastal hotel in Monterey under immense, cruel pressure, and begged Anna never to let anyone convince her that being born far from power meant being born entirely without rights. The next morning, Richard was already standing on the chilly sidewalk outside Anna's building, having spent the entire night agonizing over his profound failure to protect the woman he loved. When Anna emerged, clutching her purse tightly with her mother's documents safely tucked inside, he stepped forward, offering no excuses, only a desperate desire to accompany her to the lawyer's office. Anna opened the taxi door and warned him in a steady, unbroken voice that if he got into the car, he would hear things that would absolutely destroy his carefully curated version of his family's legacy. The ride to the downtown financial district passed in a heavy, suffocating silence, as Richard noticed the small details of Anna's exhaustion that his previous busy life had completely ignored. Upon arriving at Arthur Vance's modest office, the white-haired attorney evaluated Richard with a piercing gaze, refusing to extend his hand in greeting. Arthur opened a thick, worn binder and stated plainly that in this particular room, the Lancaster fortune and surname spoke much softer than the undeniable weight of historical documents and buried injustices. Arthur systematically laid out the tragic history of the Pinnacle, a beautiful coastal hotel in Monterey built decades ago by the Sutton family, which had been absorbed by the Lancaster conglomerate through highly questionable maneuvers. Mary Sutton had been an indirect heir whose signature relinquishing her rights was obtained under intense, mysterious duress when she was entirely isolated and financially broken. Richard listened without moving a single muscle, his jaw clenched tight as he realized his mother had never wanted to just expel Anna. She had wanted to completely obliterate the bridge before anyone discovered it even existed. By the late afternoon, before Arthur could formally notify the Lancaster corporate board, an anonymous, highly damaging tip began circulating rapidly across San Francisco's elite digital gossip columns. It spoke vaguely but clearly of a young, pregnant wife abandoning a billionaire's mansion, demanding a luxurious penthouse, and using her unborn child as leverage to extract millions of dollars from a prestigious family. Anna read the toxic notifications on her phone while sitting quietly in a small corner cafe, instantly recognizing Eleanor's signature method of destroying an enemy's reputation without leaving a single identifiable fingerprint. Richard received the same alerts moments later from his panicked public relations advisors, his face instantly hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury as he reached for his phone to declare war. However, Anna gently placed her hand over his, stopping him from making an explosive call, realizing that Eleanor actively wanted him to appear out of control to validate her twisted narrative. Instead of retreating into the shadows, Anna put her phone away and stated with absolute clarity that she was done letting other people narrate the story of who she was. Leaving Richard at the cafe, Anna returned to the lawyer's office to record a simple, unedited video statement against a plain, unassuming white wall, devoid of any professional lighting or dramatic makeup. Looking directly into the lens, she firmly denied asking for a single penny, stated she would not be silenced by non-disclosure agreements, and demanded respect for her mother, Mary Sutton. She explicitly warned that her unborn child would never be used as a strategic weapon by any wealthy dynasty, sending a shockwave that no highly paid corporate crisis manager could ever hope to contain. The honest, raw video spread with astonishing speed, completely eclipsing the planted gossip as everyday women and former hospitality workers recognized the all-too-familiar, polite violence of the extremely wealthy. The name Mary Sutton suddenly resurfaced across internet forums, with retired maids and elderly bellhops sharing fond memories of the kind woman who had been bullied out of her own heritage. This collective outpouring of memory terrified the Lancaster executives far more than any lawsuit, because while documents could easily be tied up in court for decades, massive public memory was utterly uncontrollable. Richard, driven by a desperate need to understand the past, drove down the scenic coastline to Monterey, stopping at the currently boarded-up administrative building of the Pinnacle Hotel. There he encountered Mr. Jenkins, an elderly caretaker hired to watch the property, who fondly remembered Mary Sutton not as a calculating threat, but as a genuinely good woman who belonged with the hard-working staff. When the old man nervously mentioned the dark rumors of Mary being a legitimate heir who was made to disappear in tears, Richard felt a profound, suffocating shame for the lives his family had casually destroyed. That evening, Richard found Anna resting on a park bench overlooking the dark, restless ocean in Monterey, her face stripped of the heavy armor she wore in the presence of aggressive lawyers. Before they could bridge the emotional chasm between them, a sleek black car pulled up, and Penelope Vaughn, a notorious society columnist allied with Eleanor, jumped out alongside a flashing camera. Penelope began shouting invasive, loaded questions about a financial settlement and Anna's supposed scheme to steal a piece of the upcoming lucrative hotel renovation project. Richard immediately stepped forward, his voice a lethal whisper as he ordered the photographer to shut the camera off, but Anna gently touched his arm, refusing to hide behind his wealth. She faced the blinding flash directly, declaring that anyone wishing to discuss her character should examine their own conscience first, effectively neutralizing Penelope's ambush with breathtaking grace. When the car finally sped away, Richard sat quietly beside his exhausted wife, confessing that he was finally ready to stop trusting the convenient lies he had been spoon-fed since childhood. The following morning, Arthur Vance received a highly unexpected, encrypted message from Andrew Sterling, an elderly, deeply conflicted board member of the Lancaster Enterprise who requested a highly secretive meeting. They arranged to meet in a dimly lit, completely empty lounge of an obscure boutique hotel in the city. An encounter Richard was strictly forbidden from attending to maintain absolute neutrality. Andrew arrived looking fragile, leaning heavily on a cane, and handed Anna a thin, incredibly dangerous manila folder containing the original, unredacted internal minutes from the aggressive corporate acquisition of the Pinnacle. Anna stared at the faded pages, her eyes locking onto a handwritten marginal note explicitly stating that Mary Sutton needed to be permanently neutralized before the final financial formalization could occur. Andrew, his voice trembling with decades of suppressed guilt, confessed that Mary had discovered the illegal transfer of family shares, but Eleanor Lancaster, young and ruthlessly ambitious, feared the scandal would destroy their corporate ascent. The most devastating blow came when Andrew quietly revealed that Richard's father had genuinely loved Mary and that she was fiercely pressured to disappear entirely without a trace because she was carrying a child. The terrifying word hung in the stale air of the lounge, striking Anna with the force of a physical blow as the horrifying parallel of her own life suddenly snapped into sharp focus. She stumbled out of the hotel with freezing hands, frantically calling Arthur Vance to tell him that her mother had been pregnant when forced to sign away her life, turning a corporate dispute into a monstrous emotional crime. When Richard heard the news, the sickening realization that his mother was merely repeating a successful, decades-old strategy to erase another pregnant woman from their bloodline completely shattered his remaining loyalty. Refusing to let history repeat itself in the shadows, Richard forcefully summoned an emergency, mandatory board meeting in Monterey, demanding the presence of external auditors, corporate lawyers, and Arthur Vance. Eleanor called her son just hours before the gathering, her voice dropping to a dangerous, venomous hiss, warning him that if he opened this door, he might discover his beloved wife was actually his own half-sister. The cruel, calculated lie failed to destroy Richard. Instead, he calmly replied that the real problem was never Anna, but Eleanor's pathetic inability to win a war against a woman who never even wanted to fight. The extraordinary board meeting convened in a humid, oppressive conference room located just a few blocks away from the boarded-up facade of the Pinnacle Hotel, very site of the original sin. Anna sat bravely at the main table wearing a simple, light-colored dress and her mother's shell pendant proudly displayed, projecting a profound serenity that absolutely no one in the room could mistake for weakness. Eleanor arrived deliberately late, peeling off her fine leather gloves and arrogantly asking if corporate governance had now been replaced by cheap emotional theater orchestrated by an unstable hormonal girl. Before Richard could launch a fierce defense, Anna calmly advised her mother-in-law to update her tired script, reminding the room that a pregnant woman was more than capable of reading fraudulent contracts. Arthur Vance proceeded to distribute the explosive, undeniable copies of the unredacted meeting minutes, the suspicious financial transfers, and the handwritten notes detailing the systematic, brutal neutralization of Mary Sutton. The final, crushing blow arrived when Andrew Sterling slowly walked through the side door, defying Eleanor's reign of terror, to publicly testify that they had all known exactly what they were doing to an innocent woman. Trapped by undeniable proof and the sudden, overwhelming mutiny of her oldest ally, Eleanor sprang from her leather chair, her impeccable elegance shattering into a desperate, sharp-edged fury as she tried to justify her actions. She claimed she was the only one holding the fragile family together, while Richard's father recklessly endangered their empire over a naive, pathetic woman who made everyone feel immensely guilty for their wealth. Anna stared at her without a single ounce of pity, stating clearly that Eleanor had chosen to ruthlessly crush a pregnant woman, instead of fighting the men who oppressed her, and had foolishly attempted the exact same trick twice. The board, deeply terrified of the catastrophic legal and public relations fallout, swiftly voted to formally suspend Eleanor Lancaster from any decisions regarding the massive coastal redevelopment project pending a full, independent audit. Richard leaned across the heavy mahogany table, looking directly into the eyes of the woman who had raised him, declaring that if their empire's value relied on a buried injustice, it was already entirely worthless. Eleanor signed the necessary suspension documents with a violently trembling hand, bitterly promising Richard he would deeply regret this day, before walking out of the room completely utterly alone, her reign of terror finally over. When the heavy boardroom doors finally closed and the executives quickly scattered, Richard remained standing perfectly still by the large glass window, staring blankly out at the churning waters of the Monterey Bay. Anna approached him slowly, not out of lingering pity, but because she recognized the profound, agonizing grief of a man realizing his entire childhood had been carefully constructed upon a foundation of cruelty. She acknowledged that he had kept his promise to stand by the truth, and he replied with a heavy sigh that learning his mother's true nature did not instantly erase the deep scars he had allowed to form. Stepping out of the building, they were instantly met by a chaotic swarm of flashing cameras and shouting reporters, alerted by someone likely still fiercely loyal to Eleanor's crumbling regime. Rather than sneaking out the back exit as the lawyers frantically suggested, Anna stood tall on the front steps, firmly demanding that her family's history be treated with the respect it deeply deserved. She clarified that her marriage would not be decided by cheap sensationalism, and Richard added to the microphones that he remained fully responsible for everything he had previously failed to see, leaving the press stunned by their raw honesty. During the long, quiet weeks that followed the explosive meeting, Richard did not attempt to force a cinematic reconciliation, completely understanding that true trust had to be painstakingly rebuilt through consistent daily actions. He spent his days buried in endless audits, ensuring Mary Sutton's rightful legacy was properly restored, and his evenings standing across the street from Anna's apartment in the city, sending a simple message to let her know he was present. Anna spent her time reading her mother's recovered letters with Arthur Vance, slowly transforming the tragic ghost of Mary Sutton into a vibrant, fiercely proud woman who had successfully navigated an incredibly terrifying world. The absolute final attempt at confrontation occurred on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Eleanor surprisingly appeared at the door of the modest apartment, stripped of her expensive jewelry and wearing a stark black dress. She stepped inside, looking completely out of place, and her eyes immediately locked onto the beautiful framed photograph of Mary Sutton sitting proudly on the small, simple wooden dining table. Eleanor confessed in a fragile, trembling voice that she had spent decades paralyzed by the terrifying thought that she was entirely replaceable, hating Mary simply because she possessed a quiet dignity that millions of dollars could never buy. Anna listened to the broken woman, feeling a complicated, exhausting mixture of profound sorrow and lingering anger, acknowledging that Eleanor's deep personal pain completely explained her cruel path, but absolutely did not erase the footprints she left behind. Richard arrived breathless, tipped off by a worried Martha, and froze in the doorway, fully expecting to find a screaming match, but instead found a heavy, transformative silence hanging between his wife and his mother. Eleanor reached into her designer bag, produced a signed, legally binding document, officially removing herself from all family trusts and business operations, and quietly walked out, finally taking responsibility for the devastation she had caused. The independent audit concluded shortly after, establishing a massive, fully funded educational trust in the name of Sutton and Company, dedicated specifically to providing scholarships and professional training for working-class youth in the hospitality sector. Anna finally returned to the Pacific Heights mansion, carrying only a small suitcase, purposefully opening the heavy curtains to let the bright California sun wash away the cold, oppressive shadows of the past. She set new, unbreakable rules for their shared life, declaring that nobody would ever again use the concept of family love as an excuse to exert control, an agreement Richard accepted with profound, tearful gratitude. Their son was born in the very early hours of a fiercely stormy Tuesday morning, quiet San Francisco hospital, arriving not amidst a chaotic corporate scandal, but surrounded by a hard-won, beautiful peace. Richard held Anna's hand tightly through every agonizing hour of labor, constantly whispering that he was exactly where he needed to be, keeping the sacred promise he had made to never arrive late again. When the healthy baby boy finally let out his first loud cry, Anna named him Thomas Mary Lancaster, proudly giving him a second name that carried the immense, undeniable strength of a woman who utterly refused to be erased. Hours later, Eleanor hesitantly appeared at the doorway of the hospital room, asking for explicit permission before taking a single step closer to the bed, a miraculously respectful gesture from a formerly tyrannical woman. She looked down at the tiny, sleeping infant wrapped in a soft blanket, her eyes filling with genuine tears, and softly whispered a gentle welcome to Thomas, conspicuously omitting the heavy burden of the Lancaster surname. It was a quiet, almost invisible victory that signaled the end of a generational curse, proving that even the hardest hearts could eventually learn to surrender to the simple, uncomplicated miracle of new life. 5 years after the magnificent reopening of the Pinnacle in Monterey, the sprawling property was no longer just a playground for the incredibly wealthy, but a thriving, vibrant hub of genuine opportunity and rich culinary history. Anna walked through the grand, sunlit lobby holding the tiny, endlessly curious hand of her son, Thomas, while Richard followed closely behind, carrying a stack of architectural plans and the boy's forgotten jacket. Stopping in front of a beautiful, dedicated memorial wall, the young boy pointed a tiny finger at a stunning black-and-white portrait of a woman wearing a familiar shell necklace, asking if that was the grandmother he never got to meet. Anna knelt down to his eye level, gently touching the wooden frame, and explained that Grandmother Mary had left behind a powerful story so that Thomas would never have to feel small in front of anyone. The day marked the official inauguration of the newly expanded scholarship wing, an event Anna had meticulously organized to avoid cheap red carpets, insisting instead on a humble gathering of students, dedicated teachers, and proud local workers. The atmosphere was charged with a rare, authentic joy, completely devoid of the usual suffocating corporate tension, proving that true legacy was built on lifting people up rather than systematically tearing them down. Just before the ceremony began, Eleanor arrived via a quiet side entrance, her demeanor remarkably softer than in her ruling years, carrying a small, intricately carved wooden box in her slightly trembling hands. She approached Anna cautiously, offering the box not as a grand, manipulative gift, but as a deeply personal surrender of the final piece of the past she had desperately hoarded. Inside the box lay Mary Sutton's original, faded employee identification badge from decades ago, a small piece of plastic and paper that Eleanor tearfully admitted she had kept out of a pathetic, cowardly need for absolute control. Anna accepted the badge with profound grace, feeling the last remaining chain of the old Lancaster cruelty simply dissolve into the salty ocean breeze drifting through the open lobby doors. Stepping up to the simple wooden podium, she delivered a breathtaking, unscripted speech, declaring that the building had once taught an elegant lie, but would now serve as a beacon of truth and unyielding dignity for generations. The crowd erupted into genuine, roaring applause, and even young Thomas cheered loudly, entirely unaware of the immense historical weight being lifted from his small shoulders, knowing only that his mother was fiercely brave and incredibly loved. Following the beautiful ceremony, an elderly, humble man named Charles, who had once worked as a junior bellhop during Mary's time, nervously approached Richard and Anna holding a sealed, aging envelope tight against his chest. He explained that Mary had entrusted him with the package just a month before she vanished, asking him to keep it safe just in case the wealthy family ever tried to lie about what she had endured. Richard gently guided Anna to a quiet, secluded corner of the lobby, where she carefully broke the incredibly old seal, her heart pounding fiercely against her ribs as she finally pulled out the hidden contents. Inside was the complete, untorn version of the photograph Richard had found years ago. It clearly showed a very pregnant Mary Sutton standing proudly next to Richard's protective father, while a young, visibly terrified Eleanor lingered in the background. The image instantly destroyed the cruel myth of the calculating seductress, revealing instead a deeply exhausted woman trying desperately to survive a chaotic, terrifying world that was actively conspiring against her unborn child. Eleanor, drawn to the quiet commotion, stepped closer and saw the complete photograph, her hand instantly flying to her mouth as the undeniable reality of her past cruelty finally stared back at her in full focus. Little Thomas tugged at Eleanor's sleeve, innocently asking if she was sad because she had done bad things in the past, prompting the once fearsome matriarch to drop to her knees and weep openly in front of them all. With the breathtaking, absolute clarity that only a young child possesses, Thomas patted her trembling shoulder and simply told her that she just needed to make sure she did good things from now on. Richard wiped a tear from his eye, stepping forward to pull his mother up from the floor, silently acknowledging that while the deep wounds would never fully vanish, the toxic infection had finally been completely cured. That evening, the family walked together along the beautiful, rocky coastline of Monterey, the restless ocean waves crashing rhythmically against the shore as Thomas ran happily a few steps ahead of them. Richard wrapped a warm jacket around Anna's shoulders, kissing the top of her head as they stopped to look back at the brightly illuminated hotel that now stood as a monument to truth rather than deception. They had walked through the absolute darkest shadows of a terrifying generational trauma, finally learning the profound lesson that true peace is never found by hiding the painful truth, but by having the immense courage to pull it directly into the light. In the end, the greatest legacy we can ever hope to leave our children is not a heavy vault of money built on the silent suffering of others, nor is it a prestigious surname shielded by layers of convenient lies. It is the unyielding integrity to admit our deepest flaws, to seek forgiveness even when it arrives devastatingly late, and to fiercely protect the inherent dignity of every human being we encounter. Life teaches us that holding on to bitter resentments and exercising cruel control only builds a fragile prison for the soul. True love, the kind that survives the harshest storms, requires the quiet bravery to stand firmly beside those who are hurting, actively dismantling the towering walls of pride, prejudice, and fear. Ultimately, a family built upon a foundation of honest respect, genuine vulnerability, and shared compassion will forever outlast any towering empire constructed on the shaky grounds of silent terror and buried shame.